How to install a WeatherTRAK Pro2 to Pro3 upgrade kit. As you prepare to install your ET Pro3 upgrade kit, you can see from the display in the list price catalog that this process will involve keeping some of the existing components of your existing Pro2 controller. So you're going to keep your existing Pro2 enclosure, as well as your WeatherTRAK service and the transformer that the controller was using, as well as your station keys. But we'll go in and replace the old Pro2 components, including the front panel and the chassis, including the modem and the antenna, with new Pro3 controller components. So it'll essentially be an all-new controller, which will update the warranty to a new 5-year warranty on the hardware. Today we're going to assume that you've already purchased your WeatherTRAK Pro2 to Pro3 upgrade kit and are ready to install. So today's training we're going to discuss the hardware that you receive with the upgrade kit and then the upgrade process, where we'll walk through the controller installation and controller activation process. So when you first open up your Pro2 to Pro3 upgrade kit, and the first thing you pull out is the new WeatherTRAK Pro3 front panel that will replace the Pro2 panel, and with its faster processors and new modem, it's just ready to handle the challenges of today's water manager. Then you'll find the LTE antenna for the LTE modem that's installed in the front panel, and you'll find the new ET Pro3 chassis, or the valve wire terminal board, that will replace the chassis in the existing Pro2 controller. This is where a lot of the work is during the installation. Replacing all of the wires that are inserted into this board is the real physical challenge of doing the upgrade process. Make sure you're aware of the station count of the board you're pulling out of the box. Calculating how many stations your chassis can handle is a matter of counting the boards and keys in your WeatherTRAK controller. Each board and key that you see adds 6 stations to the WeatherTRAK station count. So if you have 1 board and 1 key, you have a 12-station chassis. 1 board and 2 keys is an 18-station chassis. 1 board and 3 keys is a chassis capable of as many as 24 stations. If you have a controller that has 25 or more stations, you'll get a chassis that has a second 24-station output board connected to the first one. So if your first board has 3 keys in it and you add a second board, your hardware is capable of managing 30 stations. And then 6 stations for every key that you add to the second board, up to a 48-station controller. So make sure your WeatherTRAK Pro3 chassis has enough stations to replace the existing Pro2. And lastly, we've provided a new plastic envelope to hold all of the controller documentation. And we've updated the product documentation inside the envelope with Pro3 documentation. And that's all that comes in the box, but before you throw the box away, be sure to take a picture of the information posted on the outside of the box, including not only the part number from the catalog, but also the new controller serial number and SIM card serial number. So if you want to pre-activate that controller, you could submit that information to our team at support@hydropoint.com. So now we know what's in the box and we know the hardware that will be involved in the upgrade process. Let's talk about the hardware installation. And you're not going to need a ton of tools to get this done, but before you go out, make sure that you have a controller key, make sure you have your wire labels, your 7/16" nut driver, as well as a pair of channel locks, and I always like a small flathead screwdriver when I'm working on controllers. The first thing you do is find the controller and open it up with the CH751 key, and once the door is open, when I'm working on the controller, I like to take the door off to open up the working space. Loosen the finger screws and remove the WeatherTRAK panel from the enclosure. Then disconnect the ribbon cable and the antenna and remove the panel from the controller. Be sure to keep track of that Pro2 panel because we're going to need it in later steps. This is when I take out those station keys and put them aside in a safe place, because I'm going to need them in future steps as well. So that's 2 things we have to keep track of that we just pulled out of the controller. Remember, we need to collect the old Pro2 serial number so we can tie the new Pro3 serial number to that old Pro2 serial number and transfer over with it all of the programming and history of the controller. It's also easy to forget to pull out the station keys from the Pro2 panel, and we need to transfer those or the Pro3 panel won't work. The next thing I do is kill power to the board by disconnecting the wire coming from the transformer at the adapter that plugs into the board on the top right-hand corner of the 24-station terminal board. Then we prepare to take the chassis off by getting out our wire markers and labeling all of the wires in the controller. This includes not only master valves and flow sensors, but rain sensors, and every station valve should have a wire marker. So we know exactly how the Pro2 was wired and can wire the Pro3 the same way. Once all the wires have been labeled and disconnected, the next step is to take the chassis out of the enclosure. To do this, we loosen the 4 bolts that are attaching the chassis to the enclosure. Then you remove the chassis from the enclosure, paying special attention to the wire that comes from the transformer. And because we don't use it for a while, it's easy to forget that that power wire is mounted underneath the chassis. But if you do forget until everything else is plugged in, everything will need to be uninstalled from the chassis so we can lift it up to run that power wire underneath. So it can cost you a lot of time if you forget that the power wire is mounted underneath the chassis. So paying special attention to run the power wire right up the middle of the chassis. We then line up the 4 holes on the WeatherTRAK chassis with the 4 posts on the back of the enclosure. And then you want to bolt down that chassis. I usually start with the bolt where the grounding lug is attached. Hopefully you find your grounding lug attached to a number 6 bare copper wire that runs to a grounding source in the field. That earth ground grounds this entire chassis at one of these locations, so that's usually the bolt that I start with, and then I tighten the other 3 bolts to secure the chassis to the enclosure. And now we're ready to start reinstalling the wiring, using our wire labels to duplicate the way the controller was previously wired. That way we're sure that the Pro3 hardware is set up the same exact way that the Pro2 hardware was. So using those wire labels as a guide, we plug in all of our field wires and our flow sensors and master valves and all of the other components that we pulled out of the Pro2. And once everything's reinstalled in the chassis, then we're ready to install the new antenna for the LTE modem in the controller. So we drop that antenna wire through the hole and tighten it in the enclosure, making sure that the little dot on top of the antenna is facing the open space as described in the installation instructions. And after the antenna is secure, we hunt down those station keys from the Pro2 controller and replace them in the Pro3. And now we're ready to power up the new Pro3 front panel. So we start by removing the cloud update key from where it's taped to the back of the controller and insert it in the USB port in the back of the Pro3 panel. This allows the controller to receive future firmware updates over the air. So we plug that in first and then attach the ribbon cable and the antenna. And once that's done, we're ready for takeoff. So we power up the controller. We plug the power adapter back into the board, see the lights on the chassis come to life, and in short order, the front panel should light up and start beeping. And when everything's powered up, we just attach the faceplate back to the enclosure using the finger screws and tighten those down, secure everything in place. Then we finish up the hardware installation by replacing the door and taking out the old plastic information guide and replacing it with the new updated materials. And once the hardware installation is complete, the only thing left to do is the controller activation. So just like any WeatherTRAK you've ever installed, we need to call and activate that controller. Not only are we turning on the cell phone card that provides the communication, but with an upgrade we're also documenting all of the serial number information. So the old Pro2 serial number that has all of the controller's programming, including the station settings and the microzone location information, as well as all of the controller history about runtimes and settings changes. And when you activate this controller, you'll tie the Pro2 serial number to the Pro3 serial number, which will allow us just to carry over all of that information, which is a blessing because not only do you not need to reprogram everything, but also the management history stays in place. So once the controller is all powered up and you've set the time and date and max active stations, it's time to call the WeatherTRAK support services at 1-800-362-8774. They're going to ask you for the old serial number and the new serial number and a few other controller specifics to get that SIM card activated and the process to replace the old serial number with the new serial number underway. And while this information can be emailed to us at support@hydropoint.com, it's highly recommended that you make sure that the controller is online and the activation process is underway before you leave the site. A great way to save time is to schedule an appointment with a customer support team. That way WeatherTRAK support services call you at a predetermined time and eliminate any time spent on hold waiting for a customer service agent. And if you want more information on WeatherTRAK, check out our WeatherTRAK training services by subscribing to our YouTube channel and checking out our alert and troubleshooting videos. Or visit our knowledge base where we provide task-based support articles that walk through the processes required by everyday management. And then of course we have the HydroPoint University training store where we provide on-demand free training for our users, where you'll find the WeatherTRAK certified installation training, which is one I would recommend if you're looking for more specifics on the details of controller installation.